morning. How are you? If you're a guest this welcome, we're thrilled that you're here. We're a church. The way we think about things is we like to gather and wrestle with who Jesus really is and what his dreams for the world really are, and then to spend the other 6 days fleshing that out. We think the other 6 days are not just a distraction to Sunday, but actually what makes the whole walking with Jesus thing work, because we think those other 6 days grow us. That they grow us in our... I'm sorry, I'm really distracted in my head, and I know I've used this joke before, and it's not a joke, but I have the sensation that my zipper is down, and I'm going to check. Okay, it's not. Sorry. That's just... It would have been much worse if I didn't. Okay, so... Because these are those pants. You know how you own those pants that you always forget to do the zipper on? These are those pants for me. Stop looking below my waist. Okay. Okay, so... we think those other 6 days are paramount in our own desires to follow Jesus. Like, oftentimes we think that, like, growing in Jesus is about doing cerebral stuff and reading our Bibles and praying and getting alone, and that's certainly essential, but we think it's those other 6 days and the opportunities God affords us to flesh that out and live that out because, doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. And then those other 6 days when we think about our identity as a church, we're kind of convinced that we don't have anything new to say to our community and to the Helena Valley, that most people, no matter where they're at with Jesus, they know the claims of Christ and the invitation of Christ. And so the way we think about it is we want to retell the story by putting a serving towel over our arm and like telling it by the way we serve. Hence the name Narrate, because we think Jesus is true, and we think that it's a story to be told, not a fact to be, missed the word. What would it be? Transcribed? Doesn't work, but we'll go with it. Night skiing would be a means to that end, and that's a compliments of a Narrate family that 3 years in a row now has said, like, we'd like to do this as an extension of our opportunity to say to friends and coworkers and classmates, and for you to take a handful of tickets to work or to school or whatever, and just go like, come serve. And I was just talking to a guy before the service. He's like, people are asking me like, okay, so what's the catch? There isn't one. Like, minus the fact that some anonymous person will be asked to preach a small sermon 20 minutes into the deal. There's not really a catch. Nor will there be a 20-minute sermon. And by the way, the ticket is completely phony. So you might need to clear that up for your friends. Like, they don't all need a ticket. That's just our way of kind of trying to make it a little more tangible so that you're not going like, hey, night skiing, but you're, to put something in someone's hands. So there you go with that. If you're a guest, you stepped probably right into what someone like myself fears that you would step into, because we're finishing up a series this morning. So that's always kind of weird, and I'll do my best to bring you up to speed. And then not only that, but we're finishing up a series on money. Aren't you glad you're here? We've been doing this series called How to Be Rich, and we're calling it How to Be Rich, not How to Get Rich, because what we've talked about is that we are surrounded by messages about how to get rich, and there's nothing wrong with being rich. God doesn't have any problems with being rich. In fact, there's some really strategic reasons why that's good for the kingdom of God, for there to be some rich people. And yet, what we've been saying is, like, what happens is many times we cross the line from not rich to rich, but we don't know we cross the line because we don't feel rich, which has been part of the issue, is trying to go like, whether or not you feel rich might not really matter. You probably still are rich. And what happens is we've crossed that line, and we didn't know we crossed the line because it's a moving target. And because we don't know we've crossed the line because it's a moving target, we don't ever stop to ask and go like, so what does it look like to be rich? And instead we just spend all of our energy trying to get rich. And part of what we've discovered in this series is most of us, maybe many of us, the majority of us we already are rich. That if you were to compare ourselves with the rest of the world, if you make $37,000 a year in your household, you're among 4% of income earners. Which means even teachers are rich. Missed the teacher joke again. If you make $45,000 a year as a family, you're among 1% of income earners in the world. And another way to think about this, it was pointed out to me this week, would be maybe just to pay attention to the problems that you have. Because what you might discover is that you have rich person problems. Like if you're kind of like 40 degrees, it's not even February yet. Like, the snow is going to be terrible. I want to ski, and it snowed like once all year. If you're kind of grumbling like me about the ski conditions, well, then you're rich. Because rich people strap sticks to their feet and go down mountains and risk their lives. Like, poor people don't do that. Or if you're thinking like, no football today, what am I going to do? Well, guess I'll address that pile of laundry. That pile of laundry, that's a rich person problem. Like, poor people don't have piles of laundry. They don't have washing machines, but they certainly don't have piles of laundry. It's a rich person problem. Or if you're, like so many of you, continuing to be challenged by nutrition and organic and not organic and vegan and all those conversations, and the more you study them, the scarier it gets, and you're like, I don't know what to eat, and am I killing my kids, and should I go to soy, and all those different things. And those are some worthwhile conversations, but you're rich. Because rich people shop at the health food store. Non-rich people don't get to, right? And rich people, they worry about, like, is there pesticide in my food? Non-rich people go like, food, don't care what's in it. I'll eat it, right? It's a rich person deal. Or if there's people in another part of the country that you haven't seen for a while and you'd really like to see them or you'd like them to come see you, rich person problem. Got a car, makes a funny noise, thinking need a new car. Rich person problem. Got a house, won't sell. Rich person problem. Got a couple houses, neither of them will sell. Rich person problem, though pretty soon it'll be a poor person problem. Like, have a portfolio, whether it's like your 401k or some IRAs or maybe even some rental property, and they're kind of a pain right now because your interest rate isn't what you hoped it would be, or you got a renter that's a pain and you got to get them out of there, but you don't want to get sued. Rich person problem, right? Like poor people, they don't have enough money to think about 30 years down the road. Rich people get to do that. Poor people are worried about today. Like if we'll just, or think of college. Maybe you're thinking of someone like, you got a kid that's getting ready to go to college, or you're getting ready to go to college, and you're looking at all these applications, you're looking at all these accepted letters, and you're going like, where am I going to go? Where's she going to go? Where's he going to go? How are we going to afford this? Too much green tea. Rich person problem, right? Like poor people don't go to college. It's a rich person problem. And so what we've been wrestling with is really where it starts is to go, hey, I'm rich, and if we define it by I have more than I need, then yeah, I'm rich. And what's driving this series is that there are places in the Bible where God, and this is kind of a paradigm shift for many of us, where God just speaks directly to rich people. And he just says, like, I just want to talk to the rich people. And we've asked, like, why would God do that? Because God doesn't tend to play favorites. And what we've wondered is, well, maybe rich people have opportunities and temptations that non-rich people don't have. And maybe God is as personal as Jesus claims that he is, and maybe he wants to help us with that. And we've been looking at one particular place in the New Testament where Paul is writing to Timothy. Paul's kind of a big wheel, right? There's Jesus and there's Paul, and so much of a big deal that some people follow Paul, not Jesus, but that's a separate sermon illustration and not a good idea, by the way. So Paul is writing to Timothy, who's this young up-and-coming leader, and going, hey, Timothy, when you get with the rich people, you got to help them with this. You got to bring this up. You got to talk to them about it. And the first thing he says is tell them they're rich. And you go like, that is so dumb. How could rich people not know that they're rich? And that's kind of what we've been trying to do in this series is go, well, we do it. And probably the only person in the world that doesn't do it is Bill Gates, because there's always like, right, someone ahead of you. And Paul says to Timothy, tell them they're rich. And then he says, tell them not to lean into their stuff. And remember, we did this deal where we just talked about that the temptation among rich people is that they begin to put their security in their stuff, and then they begin to think, like, if I could just make the stack higher, if I could just get more, then I'll be rich. And the answer to, like, how much will it take for you to be secure is always more. And the reality is Paul says, tell them not to lean into that, but to lean into me and to find ways every day to lean into me. And then last week, Paul says, tell them to be rich in good deeds, generous and willing to share. And the question that we asked is, what if in order for rich people to be good at being rich, what if it requires that they pre-decide? That they pre-decide to give some of their money and some of their time. And really the tension there is, what if rich people live in a culture that is so rich in options? There's so many things they could do with all their extra time, because rich people have extra time, non-rich people don't. There's so much they could do with their extra money, because rich people have extra money, non-rich people don't. That what happens is they just sit down and they go, what are we going to do with our extra time? What are we going to do with our extra money? Tax return season, right? Illustration, what am I going to do with my extra? And Paul says, tell them to be rich in good deeds. To tell them that they have to pre-decide, because if they're not careful, they'll always find something else to do and something else to buy, and what will happen is someone will say, hey, were you rich in good deeds? And they'll say, well, who has time? Why? Because they filled it up with all the opportunities. And so we just wondered, what if rich people have to pre-decide? I was thinking this morning as James took the offering, like that's really what that's all about, right? This is about people who have pre-decided to go, I'm going to send some of mine to a different kingdom. So, fourth point, and then we'll be done, and we'll talk about something else starting in February. Kind of the final episode. There's one more verse in this passage from Timothy. Let me just read the first two verses that we've covered, and then we'll get to it. Command those who are rich in this present world, so there's week one, not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. There's week two. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Now the last part. That is impeccable timing. My screensaver just clicked on. Don't know why you need to know that, but I like to complain about things, and I'm complaining about that. I did not listen to Attitude Check, apparently. In this way. So verse 19 starts, in this way. Now, when Paul says in this way, he's referring back to verse 18. He's referring back to command them to be rich in good deeds, generous and willing to share. He's saying when they follow that command, when they do that, when they assess their extra, when they look at their margin and they use it for other people, when they do that, that's what the in this way refers to. They will lay up treasure for themselves. Now, probably all of us are already going like, ooh, already know where the sermon's going, like seen it on late night cable TV, big gold earrings, lots of makeup, big hair. Seen it before, heard it before. Some of you have been around church long enough to go like, yep, know where this sermon's going. I just want to stop there. Because I think what happens here is Paul's saying something that frankly doesn't make sense. It's illogical. But in our Christianese, we just kind of skim right by it and go, that makes sense. But it doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, God is who he says that he is. Because when you have something and you give some away, what do you have? You don't have to be an accountant. You have less, right? You have something, you give some away, you have less. Paul is saying, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves. So what Paul's saying is when you have something and you give some away, time, money, you actually have better. Or you could even argue that the context says more. Can we just agree that doesn't make any sense? When you have some and you give some away, Paul's going, you'll have more. And then here's why. Watch this. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age. They'll have a firm foundation. So what Paul is doing here, I know it's not shocking to us because many of us are familiar with this. Even if you haven't been to church, this is why you don't go to church, is because of sometimes this very message and the way it's abused. But what Paul is doing here is he's saying, Timothy, you got to remind them that there's a relationship between their wealth and their eternity. You got to point that out. And what Paul is doing here is tapping into a teaching that is so central to the Gospels. It's so central, it's uncomfortable. If you'll just grab the 4 Gospels and read them, Jesus hits on this point over and over and over. And it's kind of scary. And it's kind of freaky, and it's kind of uncomfortable, and it's kind of weird, and we'll talk about some of those things. And not only that, but this is a teaching that is in every corner of the Bible, if you will. It just goes cover to cover. And Paul, some would say, he doesn't even really develop the idea. He just kind of glances by it because it was such a common concept among the Jewish culture and among the early church that Paul assumed that in just referring to the idea, the audience of Timothy would have went in, oh yep, with you. We do this, right, in our subcultures. We have these phrases, these things that you just have to say a few words, and you're referring to a whole story, a whole narrative, a whole, discipline within your sector. I mean, if you're in middle school, right, like there's a phrase or a sentence or a couple words, and if you say them and you're with your friends, or you say them and you're in your school or in your class or on your team, everyone else knows what you're talking about. It's like you don't have to explain the whole story. Like we've got you. And if you say them around your parents, they're looking at you going like, when did you learn Japanese? Or whatever field you're in. If you're in real estate, if you're in banking, if you're in lending, if you're in construction, if you're an engineer, there are things you can say that all you have to do is say a few things and everyone else knows what you're talking about. The Jews did this. The technical term for it in the first century Jewish world is called a remez. And what a remez is some guys think there's over 20 of them in the Gospels themselves. They would just say a word or two or a short sentence, and what they're referring to is a whole narrative, a whole couple chapters of Scripture. So there's these times, where Jesus is eating dinner with people, and it's like things are going good, and everyone's talking about their kids and their families, and then all of a sudden Jesus says a few words, and then the next sentence is like, and then they try to take him to a cliff and stone him. And you go like, well, what just happened? What just changed? Well, oftentimes if you look, he remezed. He said a few words, and in doing, quoted something from a place like Malachi or Micah, where he said, like, all of your religion's a waste of time, God hates it, he pukes it out. And everyone's going like, well, you can't say that. And they understand the phrase, and so they're mad at him. They want to kill him because he just called them on their religiosity. One of the more famous ones, I don't know if it's technically a remez, but it gets the idea, is Jesus is hanging on the cross. And he says, my God, what does he say? Why have you forsaken me? He's referencing an entire psalm. And there's this whole psalm you can look at, Psalm 22, and when you read it, you get a much deeper picture of what Jesus was feeling and what he was feeling between himself and the Lord, and even what he wanted the observers to hear. It's called a remez. Some would say that Paul is doing something very similar here, where he's just barely touching on a subject, and the idea was people would go, oh yeah. Because what he's saying to Timothy is, Timothy, remind him that there was a relationship between what they do with their stuff and their eternity. There is a relationship between how they spend, invest, give, manage their wealth, and how they spend eternity. Not where. That would be heresy. Where is the cross? Where is grace? Where is, you can't save yourself? Where is that it's not about merit, it's about God's grace and his character and his desire to rescue you? Not where, but how. St. Timothy, remind them there is a strong relationship between what they do with their stuff and how they spend eternity. Now, last couple of weeks we paused and gave you a chance to do it. Everybody hates gatherings like this and cause you to turn and talk to the person next to you and ask a question and share your 2 cents. And we're going to do it one more time. And the question's not as good as the last couple of weeks because I made this one up. I didn't steal it, but nonetheless, we're going to do it anyway. I just wanted to talk about this, and it probably won't take you a long time. But so, stranger, spouse, whatever you want to do. But what motivates you to give time and money? Or maybe insert the word best. What most effectively, what best motivates you to give time and money? Take a moment. Okay, I'm going to interrupt. Is that right? Sorry, I asked a question that I didn't really care about the answer. It's not good to do that. How many would say that your answer is just show me with hands, some variation of the awareness of need? That the number one thing that motivates you is if you're aware of the need, then you're motivated. I thought it would be more, actually, because what they say is it's the most common motivator. That if they know of the need, if they're aware of the need, if they understand that, like we all understand we have fixed resources, fixed time, fixed money, none of us wants to give it to a place where it's not really needed. If you can really make me feel the need, then I'll give there. It's the majority. It's the most common thing. And it makes sense, right? It's also, by the way, why there's such a fine line between being made aware of a need and feeling manipulated. It's why sometimes you get annoyed when you come away from interactions with nonprofits or churches and with this sense of all you ever talk about is your needs. Of course you have needs. I have needs. My business has needs. Just because we're not for profit doesn't mean we don't have needs. Just because we don't work for a nonprofit doesn't mean that we have fixed budgets, right? This is where that line gets so fine. Because they say, tell people your needs. And churches and nonprofits, they understand this, and really what they understand is if we can get people to shed a tear, then we might engage them in their time or their money. Paul, I think, is saying, hey, guess what? I think there's a better way. Even though it's the dominant way in our culture, Paul seems to be saying that there's a more effective means of motivation. Would anybody be willing to admit that it's obedience or even guilt that would, sorry, I'm mixing those two things together, but I'm going to do that. Let's just go obedience. Obedience. Oh, good. There's a few hands. Guilt. This is candid of you. I think especially in a spiritual culture, right? Because what happens is we adopt a theology of a stern God. And what that God says is, I give it all to you anyway, right? So you give me 10% and you can keep 90. Partially true, right? But we developed this very stern God who says, I will crush your business if you don't tithe from it. Some truth there, but right, it can get a little weird. I will bless you if you give. Test me. Only place in the Bible God says test in reference to that whole interaction. But it can become about this very stern God who essentially scares us into obedience. Reminds me of my cookie jar. My kids' cookie jar. Now this was a gift to my children. I don't know from whom. I don't know how long ago. It complemented a toilet piggy bank that they had for a while. And for the first couple years, it was their piggy bank. For reasons that will become obvious in a second. And then, I don't know, in the last few weeks, one of our kids unearthed it from a cupboard and begged my wife to buy some Oreos. We're not really the kind of cookie jar on the counter family, and begged her to buy some Oreos from Costco so that we could use the cookie jar. Here's my problem with the cookie jar. Are you ready?
Get your hand on my cookie jar.
Now you laugh, but there's an inherent problem with this cookie jar. The problem is that when I'm doing the dishes, or if I get home from church and eat lunch and decide that I want to have a cookie,
get your hand on my cookie.
What do you suppose the kids do? So, a couple Sundays ago, I got home, I think I just ate lunch. I thought, I want an Oreo. And I reached my hand into the cookie jar. There are more kids standing around me than I have conceived of in my life. I mean, there are kids that don't have the last name Hushka. I don't even know where they came from, standing around, and what are they saying? Can I have a cookie? It's a broken system, is what it is. I think God is saying here, hey, I've got a motivation that is even better than the stern spiritual boss thing, though I can be all of that. They say that though awareness of need and fear / obedience / all those other things, though that's the most dominant thing, the most dominant motivator, they say that it is always a short-term motivator when it comes to people's giving. That if that's what drives our giving of time and money, it'll always follow a very predictable curve. We'll get really passionate about the organization, we'll give them lots and lots of time, and it'll happen quickly and rapidly, and it'll fall off just as quickly. We'll get really, really passionate about an organization. We'll get really, really passionate about water in Africa because people are dying because they don't have water. We'll get really passionate about AIDS in Africa because people are dying from AIDS. We'll get really passionate about poverty. We'll get passionate about any number of things. We'll get passionate about an organization in town or a church plant. And what will happen is this, over and over and over again. They say that those two things can't sustain you, which is kind of a bummer. Because what it means is if those are our motivating factors to giving time and money, then the best you can hope for is to get really excited about something for 6 months, and then something else in another 6 months, something else in another 6 months, and something else in another 6 months, both time and money, which if you want to be good at being rich is kind of broken. Because if you want to be good at being rich, isn't there this inherent desire to drill down? You know there's lots of problems. You know there's more problems than you can ever address in your lifetime. But if you could just address one or two of those and make significant impact, if you could just drill down on a couple of them. It's the way we're thinking about what God's talking to us about with international justice stuff. And as John and I and others are working on that, it's just like, okay, we understand there are way more problems than any small church in Helena could ever address. But where could we drill down? What this all means is if your motivation is awareness of need, if your motivation is fear and even obedience, best you can hope for is several things over the course of a lifetime. Paul, I think, is saying there's a better way, that there's a more effective way. I was thinking of it in terms of like physical health. It'd be like we've probably all been through the gamut of the things that can motivate us to get to the gym and eat well, right? Like it's our appearance. Then we got married, so we don't care about that anymore. And then it was like the quality of our life, and then like how you felt, and then you're like, I don't know, life's hard anyway. I'll be okay with dying. And then there's like the length of your life and kind of this. Right? There's only a few things that you can motivate. It's like someone said, hey, I've got a new gym, and there's a whole new way of motivating yourself. Which, by the way, I don't know of one. But I think that's what Paul's doing here. Because what he's saying is, hey, Timothy, I know this is spiritual. I know this is eternal. I know this is like a very big paradigm shift. But remind them that there's a relationship between what they do with their wealth and their eternity. And Jesus touches on this. And what I want to do is go look at a parable from Jesus just to kind of illustrate like he touches on this all the time. And many of you will be familiar with the parable. I just want you to view it through the lens of how to be rich. Let's go to Luke 12. In Luke 12, it starts this way. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So here we go. It's a problem today. It was a problem 2,000 years ago. Someone is rich, and they're becoming more rich. The rich are getting richer. Happening right here. And then he says, he thought to himself, what shall I do? What do I do with my extra? Do I buy another car? Do I build a bigger house? What do I do with my extra? Do I update my wardrobe? What do I do with my extra? Do I send a kid to college? Do I send, a new well to Africa? What do I do with my extra? And then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. A brilliant idea if all there is to this life is this life, right? That's really where the edge cuts on this steel. I've got all this extra, I can store it, I can use it, and then I don't have to work as hard, and I'll be safe and secure for a longer amount of time. It's a really good idea. It's a brilliant scheme if there is no eternity. If there is nothing beyond death, if there is no God, it's brilliant. And then 12:20 says this, but God. And you go, wait a minute, why do you have to bring God into this? Well, that's what Jesus does, and that's what he did. He was constantly saying to people, hey, wait a minute, you might have been made for more. You might have been made for better. There is this thing called sin and the fall, and it's corrupting your humanity. I want to restore you through grace to your whole humanity. That's what Jesus does. He says, but God. And then 12:20 continues, but God said to him, you fool. He's not a fool because he's wealthy. We've already established that. He's not a fool because he's rich. He's a fool in Jesus' estimation because of the way he's thinking about his wealth. He's a fool because he's not thinking about his wealth through the lens of eternity. He's a fool because he's not thinking like there is a connection between my life after death and my wealth and prosperity now. And then he says, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. Now, this is weird because the guy's going, wait a minute, you can't take my life, I'm not out of money. Like, I'm not out of money. You can't take my life. And I think what God is establishing here is just like you can't take full credit for your wealth, they say that there's no atheist farmers. I don't know if that's true or not, but it kind of makes sense on the surface level, right? Because who better can appreciate the forces outside of their own power for wealth? The weather patterns and the soil and bugs and all of the dynamics that come into. And what Jesus is saying to this guy is just like you didn't have control over the bugs and the weather rights and or the weather patterns and where your land was versus where it could have been and what plot you got versus what plot your brother got. Just like you don't have control over any of that, you don't have control over the length of your life. And then Jesus asks a brilliant question. Then who will get what you prepared for yourself? And the answer is somebody else. But in this guy's case, not because he's generous, but because he's dead. Right? Who will get what you've stored for yourself? Somebody else. Why? Because you're dead. And then Jesus applies it. This is how it will be for those who store up things for themselves but are not rich towards God. Now he's saying, you're not a fool. You're not a fool because you're wealthy. You're a fool because you're bad at being rich. And he introduces us to this idea of being rich toward God. I know it's uncomfortable. I know we've never even talked about this concept around Narrate. And to be honest with you, the reason is because of the weakness of your leader, because this stuff freaks me out too. I don't like it. I like to think about like mattering today. I don't like thinking about rewards and all of that stuff. What challenged me to reconsider it was a leader who I really admire. He said, well, then forget about it. But Jesus talked a lot about it. Like, so ignore it if you want. But Jesus talks a lot about this. See, Jesus is introducing us to what in a business sector they might call the threat of total loss. Like this man experienced total loss because he had all of this wealth, he had all of this resource, he had all of this time, and what Jesus is saying is in eternity, he has nothing to show for it. Why? Because he wasn't rich towards God. And God is saying, would you just step back and would you just view your wealth? Would you just view it through the lens of eternity? Would you just see that there are connections between what you have and what you're called to manage and what your eternity will be like? So central to the teaching of Jesus. In fact, there's another parable, and it's one of the most counterintuitive, shocking parables Jesus ever told because it's about this guy who worked for a rich guy. He was called a manager, and this manager worked for this rich guy, and then the parable starts by saying that the rich guy figured out that the manager wasn't doing a good job with his stuff, and the context seems to even portray the idea that the manager might have been like embezzling some stuff from the rich guy. And so the rich guy says to the manager, you're fired. And so then the text, Jesus goes on to tell the story that when the manager got fired, he started running to a bunch of his top clients, and he would say to this one guy like, hey, you owe the boss $1 million, make it 500 grand. And another guy, hey, you owe the boss like 100 barrels of oil, make it 10. And he started changing the debts that all of these different clients had with the boss. And you're listening to the parable, and you're reading the parable for the first time, and you're going like, this guy is toast. Jesus is going to crush this guy. And what Jesus says about the manager is this: the rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. And it's true that the children of this world, people who don't follow Jesus, are more shrewd in dealing with the world around them than are the children of the light. What's he saying? Sometimes worldly people who don't follow Jesus, they get the connection between their wealth and everything else better than people who do follow Jesus. Here's the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. Then when your earthly possessions are gone, they will welcome you to an eternal home. Like I said, I know it's uncomfortable, and yet central to what Jesus says is there's this connection. So let's go back to 1 Timothy. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, And here's kind of the punchline of the whole deal. So that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Why? So that they can take hold of the life that is truly life. Who's they? That's you, that's me, that's us. I know your professor in English told you that the Bible is boring and unapplicable. It's not. Here we see evidence. Their story is our story, and it'll be the story 2,000 years ago. There is a way of being wealthy that's not life, that's truly life. There's a way of being wealthy where the grip on your stuff is so tight and its grip on you is so tight that it's not truly life. Elsewhere, Jesus says there's a way of being wealthy where your treasure is your wealth. And when that happens, you'll never be able to give God your heart. This is why when you stand at the grocery store and you see these people who are beautiful and wealthy beyond belief, and you go like, really? 27 divorces? Like, how could you not be happy? This is why when you see a story on ESPN about an athlete that's been in the league for 15 years and filed bankruptcy, and you're like, dude, you've made like $150 million over the course of your career. How could you possibly be filing Chapter 11 or whatever chapter that is? Why? Well, because there's a way of taking hold of life that's not truly life. And this is what we want, right? None of us would be here if there wasn't this, if anything else, fleeting hope that there's a way of life that is truly life, and that the answer to that life is found in Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior. This is what we want. And Paul's going, it won't come easy. So remind yourself you're rich and find ways to lean into me, not your stuff, and pre-decide what you're going to do with your extra, and view it all of your wealth, through the lens of eternity. We're done. You're going to run out of time before you run out of money. Paul is saying, tell him to be good at being rich. Let me pray. God, I'm reminded in this season that as uncomfortable as it is to talk about money and wealth, there's also a way in which you can make us more raw and more susceptible and more open to your voice than any other. And even, God, if that emotion is anger and strong disagreement, God, I pray that you would seize that sensitivity to you, seize that conduit between ourselves and you and our families and you. God, we want the way of life that is truly life. And we would be fools to not recognize that a central warning from the text is that nothing can more rapidly get in the way of our hearts connecting to you than wealth. God, we want to pass the test of prosperity. We want to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And would you help us in our own context and our own families work this paradigm, God? Would you help us as a community help each other? And finally, God, we take pride in the fact that ours is not a conversation that's constantly about money. And so we just kind of lay this at your feet and ask that you would take it up when appropriate again, both individually and collectively. God, for people who are compelled by the life that is truly life, and they know that they've not seized that, and they know they've not surrendered their lives to Christ yet, would you encourage them as we do some singing and take communion, and invite them to receive what they can have through grace, believing that your death and resurrection miraculously, supernaturally, literally frees them from their sin.